So last year, it cost an attacker exactly $1,300 to buy the complete, administrative destruction of a mid-sized company.
Yeah, $1,300. It's wild.
I mean, for the price of like a mid-tier laptop, initial access brokers are just selling root access, bypassing all the millions of dollars that organizations have spent on perimeter defenses over the last decade.
Right. It's literally the keys to the kingdom on Clarence.
Exactly. So today, we were diving deep into the newly released 2026 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, the DBIR, to figure out, well, why the dark web market is just absolutely flooded with the keys to your network.
And how the rules of initial access have entirely flipped.
Right, the big flip. We're going to look at what this massive data set reveals about the changing physics of cyber risk, because honestly, the scale of the DBIR this year is just, it's massive.
It really provides this unique vantage point on those changing physics. I mean, we are looking at an analysis of over 31,000 real-world security incidents.
Wow.
Yeah, and of those, over 22,000 were confirmed data breaches spanning 145 countries.
So it's global.
Completely global. It is the largest single-year data set they have ever compiled. And, it kind of forces us to confront this reality that a lot of our baseline assumptions about how threat actors behave, they're simply no longer mathematically valid.
Which brings us to the mission for this deep dive. Our goal is to extract the actual actionable telemetry from those 31,000 incidents for you.
Right, skipping the fluff.
Exactly. We are bypassing the executive summaries to examine the mechanics of, how attackers are pivoting, the architecture of modern third-party compromise, and how you can actually apply this data to your own localized risk models.
Make it useful for your next security meeting.
Yeah, exactly. So you can be the smartest person in the room without having to drown in 1,000 spreadsheets. And before we get into the actual taxonomy of these attacks, I do want to mention that this deep dive is brought to you with the support of www.cisomarketplace.com and www.breached.company.
Which is going to be super relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. We'll be weaving those in, especially when we explore how leveraging specialized platforms is basically a structural necessity now, particularly when we unpack the data on supply chain vulnerabilities later on.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to that. But looking at the physical report itself, the authors made a really interesting thematic choice this year.
The donut charts.
Yes, the donut charts. The cover art features these bright red stacked concentric rings that are kind of settling into a foundation. And the authors unapologetically call them donut charts in the foreword.
Which I love. I mean, cybersecurity reports are usually so dry.
Right. But it's actually a visual representation of historical data, right?
Yeah.
So 2023, 2024, 2025, all calcifying into this baseline of foundational knowledge.
And they lead the whole thing with a quote from Heraclitus, right? The only constant is change.
Yeah, which is an interesting philosophy for a tech report.
It really frames the 2026 DBIR around this philosophy that we could almost call cyber stoicism.
Cyber stoicism, I like that.
Because we are dealing with this massive influx of sophisticated techniques, right? Generative AI, augmented automation, edge device, 0 days, highly complex identity subversion. It sounds terrifying.
Oh, it sounds like sci-fi buzzword bingo.
Exactly. But the underlying message from the authors is that managing these threats actually requires a refinement of our existing frameworks, not some complete revolution of security principles.
Right, sticking to the fundamentals.
Yeah, sticking to the fundamentals of visibility and access control remains basically the only statistically proven method for braving these systemic architectural shifts.
Which honestly brings us to probably the most jarring architectural shift in the entire 2026 data set.
The big flip.
Big flip. If we analyze the initial access vectors, so, the primary method attackers are using to establish that first beachhead in a network, we see a total inversion of historical trends.
And this is huge.
It is. Exploitation of vulnerabilities has officially overtaken credential abuse.
Wow.
Yeah, vulnerability exploitation has just skyrocketed. It's now sitting at 31% of all breaches.
While credential abuse, which has literally been the reigning champion, the vector that dominated incident response playbooks for a decade has plummeted to 13%.
Right.
I mean, does this mean passwords are secure now, or are we just leaving all our windows open?
It's definitely the open windows. I mean, think about it. We have spent the last 5 to 10 years hammering this concept of identity as the new perimeter.
Oh, yeah. Zero trust, identity everywhere.
Exactly. We deployed robust multi-factor authentication regimens, conditional access policies, user behavior analytics.
We basically put reinforced steel doors and like biometric locks on the front entrance of the house.
So we completely ignored the side of the house. We left the external-facing APIs and legacy servers completely unpatched. So the attackers just map the perimeter, find the path of least resistance, and literally walk right through the unlatched side windows.
Because why bother trying to phish an employee when the VPN server just has a giant hole in it?
Exactly. The telemetry supports that perimeter mapping hypothesis entirely. Attackers are realizing that just scanning the IPv4 space for a known CVE on a public-facing asset, it's operationally cheaper and way faster than executing a targeted, customized phishing campaign.
It's just a numbers game.
Right. When a remote code execution flaw drops for a popular VPN appliance or, a widely used file transfer tool, threat actors just automate the exploitation phase. They hit millions of endpoints in hours.
And that automation dynamic makes the report's data on remediation timelines honestly terrifying.
Oh, CISO cave data.
Yeah. So the DBIR isolates critical vulnerabilities listed in the CISO Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog, the KEV.
Right. And just for context, these aren't theoretical bugs. These are flaws with active, weaponized payloads that have been observed in the wild. People are actively getting hacked with these.
Exactly. And in 2025, only 26% of these critical vulnerabilities were fully remediated across the observed environments.
Just 26%.
And that's actually a steep decline from 38% the previous year. So the mean time to remediation is extending, while the time to exploitation is shrinking.
Yeah, and the survival analysis of these vulnerabilities really illustrates that widening gap. The report looks at day 28, so nearly a full month after a vulnerability is heavily publicized and added to the CISO list.
A month is a lifetime in cybersecurity.
Right. And by day 28, there are still 184 million open vulnerability instances globally.
184 million. That is, I can't even wrap my head around that number.
And if you compare that to 2022, where the day 28 exposure count was around 31 million, we are seeing the attack surface literally multiply exponentially. It really points to a systemic failure in how vulnerability management programs are integrating with IT operations.
Because the bottleneck isn't a lack of awareness, right? Everybody knows the vulnerability exists. The bottleneck is the friction of deployment.
Yes, the patch management process.
Right. IT ops teams are paralyzing themselves with this fear of breaking legacy production environments through aggressive patching.
Right, the classic, if it ain't broke, don't patch it because you might break it mentality.
Exactly. But if you look at the upper quartile of performers in the data set, their vulnerability management programs operate on a completely different paradigm.
They really do. They aren't waiting for a CDE to hit the CISO list before initiating emergency change control.
Right.
The top performers are actually relying on the Exploit Prediction Scoring System, EPSS, and their internal threat intelligence to proactively patch based on the probability of exploitation.
Right, rather than waiting for regulatory permission or some reactive siren to go off.
Exactly. Because if your security operations center is using the official CISO warning as the trigger for your patching cycle, you're already too late. Your infrastructure has already been exposed to automated scanning botnets for weeks at that point.
And the sheer velocity at which those 184 million open instances are being discovered requires us to really look at the mechanisms driving these scanning capabilities.
Yeah, how are they doing it so fast?
Because human operators cannot parse the global attack surface at that speed. It's literally impossible. Which brings us to the elephant in the room, AI.
Ah, yes.
The DBIR actually partnered with Anthropic this year to quantify how artificial intelligence is altering the operational tempo of these threat actors.
Which is such an important distinction because we really need to separate the theoretical fear of hyper-intelligent AI generating novel zero days from the practical reality of what AI is actually doing today.
Right. Are we fighting Skynet? Are we fighting hyper-intelligent AI hackers?
No, not yet. The Anthropic data indicates that Gen AI is functioning strictly as an operational accelerator.
An accelerator, not an inventor.
Precisely. It is not fundamentally inventing new attack vectors that sit outside the bounds of the AMER ATT&CK framework. What it is doing is compressing the time required to operationalize known techniques.
So it just makes the old tricks faster.
Way faster. It takes complex, multi-stage attack paths and dramatically lowers the technical barrier to entry. So, an operator no longer needs deep reverse engineering skills to write a custom scanning module, right?
Right.
They just leverage a large language model to instantly compile Python scripts tailored to newly announced CVEs.
It effectively acts as a force multiplier for like novice criminal syndicates, basically script kiddies on steroids.
Exactly. But the trajectory shifts from accelerator to something much more problematic when we introduce agentic AI into the equation.
Right, and this is where it gets scary.
Because we are moving beyond chat interfaces that just generate code when you ask them to, into autonomous agents capable of making executive targeting decisions on their own.
Wait, really? Like the AI makes the decisions?
Yeah, the integration of agentic AI changes the entire threat modeling calculus.
Mm.
A human operator just defines a macro objective. So, for instance, they say, infiltrate this specific financial institution's supply chain and deploy a ransomware payload.
And the AI just does it?
The agentic AI handles all the micro execution. It autonomously conducts the Nmap and mask-in reconnaissance. It parses the responses to identify vulnerable services, chains together the appropriate Metasploit modules, executes the initial payload, and then it queries Active Directory via Bloodhound to map the lateral movement path. And the craziest part is, it iterates through failure states without human intervention. If a module fails, it tries another one.
So it's actively problem-solving during the breach.
Yes.
And the DBIR timeline explicitly flags the geopolitical reality of this shift, too. They noted North Korea's official launch of Research Center 227 in March 2025.
Which is a huge development.
Yeah. This is a state-sponsored unit exclusively dedicated to developing AI-driven offensive architectures. So we have nation-state resources actively working to remove human latency from the cyber kill chain.
And for the defenders, this creates just a catastrophic bandwidth consideration.
Yeah, the SOC analysts.
Right. Security operations centers are drowning in the noise generated by AI-driven reconnaissance. When automated scanning bots are continuously bombarding every single public IP address with sophisticated probe traffic, the SOC's log aggregation tools just become saturated.
So the disruption isn't even simply the successful breach. The disruption is the resource exhaustion of your Tier 1 analysts.
Exactly. Finding a targeted, low and slow human operator hiding within that massive volume of automated telemetry, it just becomes a statistical impossibility without equally sophisticated AI on the defense side.
It's like finding a needle in a haystack, but the haystack is constantly expanding at the speed of light.
Perfect analogy.
And that resource exhaustion perfectly contextualizes the remediation crisis we talked about. If you have a vulnerable web application, the AI agents will find it instantly. There is no longer any security through obscurity.
None. Zero.
But this brings us to a much more difficult vector to secure, because we can optimize our internal patch management all day long. But what if the open window isn't even on your house?
The interconnected web.
Exactly. The DBIR highlights that attackers are heavily leveraging the interconnected web of B2B relationships, the third-party problem. And, real quick, managing third-party risk is exactly why platforms like www.cisomarketplace.com exist.
Oh, completely.
Because they help organizations vet and secure their vendor ecosystems, which, as we're about to see, is absolutely critical.
Yeah, because the third-party risk data this year is staggering. 48% of all recorded breaches now involve a third party.
Almost half.
Almost half. And that represents a 60% year-over-year increase, compounding upon a dataset that had already doubled the year prior.
This is just exploding.
We are literally watching the concept of an isolated corporate perimeter dissolve entirely. An organization's attack surface is now effectively the aggregate sum of the attack surfaces of every SaaS provider, every cloud host, and every legal counsel they contract with.
And securing that aggregate surface is precisely why integrating those vendor vetting platforms is indispensable. You cannot manage a sprawling vendor ecosystem through annual Excel spreadsheets anymore. It just doesn't work.
No, the scale is too massive.
So the DBIR categorizes this ecosystem threat into what they call the rule of three for vendor archetypes. Let's break down the mechanics of each of these three styles.
Sure. So the first archetype is the software supply chain compromise.
Okay, like the SolarWinds paradigm.
Exactly. The initial execution vector sits firmly within your internal environment, but the payload is delivered through a trusted, cryptographically signed update from a vendor.
So you think you're doing the right thing. You maintain rigorous patch management.
Right, you're patching your systems like a good admin, but the patch itself contains a malicious backdoor that was injected upstream at the vendor's development repository.
That's terrifying because you're literally inviting it in. Okay, what's the second one?
The second archetype is the vendor hosting your data. And this aligns with the massive Snowflake-related campaigns we analyzed previously.
Oh, right, where they hold the data.
Yeah. In this model, the attackers bypass your corporate infrastructure entirely. They don't even touch your network. They target the data lake hosted in the vendor's cloud environment,
And how do they usually get into that?
often by scraping InfoStealer logs on the dark web.
Mm-hmm.
They find compromised authentication tokens or credentials belonging to your employees who access that specific cloud instance, and they just log in.
So your perimeter is safe, but your data is gone anyway.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the third archetype.
Right, the vendor connection to your environment. This is the classic legacy target breach scenario.
The HVAC vendor.
Exactly. A third-party contractor, an HVAC vendor, a legal firm, a marketing agency gets compromised. And the attackers utilize the vendor's legitimate federated access rights or VPN credentials to pivot laterally right into your internal network.
And they bypass your external perimeter defenses completely because the traffic is originating from a trusted source.
Right, your firewalls look at it and say, oh, it's just the marketing agency logging in, let them through.
But the common thread across all three of these archetypes is this dilemma of what we can call spectator mode.
Yes, spectator mode.
Because if my vendor gets hacked, I'm just a spectator. What can I actually do? Security leaders look at these vectors and they feel a profound loss of operational control. I mean, you can't force a massive cloud provider to update their hypervisors. And you certainly cannot dictate the internal password complexity of your external marketing agency.
Well, while that lack of direct control is frustrating, the DBIR data reveals something really important here. Organizations are actually failing to enforce the controls they do possess.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When analyzing third-party cloud exposures, the report focuses heavily on missing or misconfigured multi-factor authentication on federated access points.
Okay.
And they found that only 23% of those specific third-party exposure issues were fully remediated.
Wait, so in 77% of cases where a vendor had insecure access into a client's environment, the client failed to enforce standard IAM hygiene. So we can conceptualize this using like a municipal water supply analogy. It doesn't matter if you install state-of-the-art reverse osmosis filters on your kitchen sink if the attacker bypasses the house entirely and pours the contaminant directly into the city's main reservoir.
Right. The infrastructure you implicitly trust is doing the delivery for them.
But the failure here isn't just that the reservoir was poisoned, it's that the organizations didn't even bother to check if the reservoir facility had a lock on the gate.
Exactly. It demands a shift from passive trust to continuous cryptographic verification. Organizations have to mandate strict service-level agreements regarding identity management
They need to require robust API security from their SaaS providers.
and enforce conditional access policies that actually scrutinize the context of incoming vendor traffic, not just blindly accepting the credential.
And obtaining that continuous visibility is where integrating threat intelligence from our other sponsor, www.breached.company, really provides critical leverage. Because if you want to dynamically adjust your risk posture, you need real-time telemetry on whether your vendor's domains are showing up in dark web data dumps or if their infrastructure is currently exposed. You can't just cross your fingers.
No, hope is not a strategy.
Right. So moving from the architecture of the perimeter to the underlying threat actors themselves. Now that we know how they get in, let's unpack who is doing this.
Yeah, and the DBIR utilizes the VIRUS framework for this, the vocabulary for event recording and incident sharing. It standardizes the taxonomy of these attacks.
It breaks incidents into 4 core components, right? Actors, actions, assets, and attributes. Let's look at the actors component first. Who is attacking us?
Well, the data really confirms the heavy industrialization of cybercrime. 88% of breaches are initiated by external actors.
Okay, so mostly outsiders.
Right. And within that subset, 87% are driven by organized criminal syndicates.
So it's not a teenager in a hoodie in a basement anymore.
No, the era of the lone, ideologically motivated hacker is statistically insignificant. We are dealing with highly structured, financially motivated corporate entities that just happen to operate outside legal jurisdictions.
They have HR departments, they have tech support.
Literally.
Yeah.
Now, internal actors do account for 12% of the data set.
Okay, the insider threat.
But a deep dive into the VIRUS actions attributes reveals that these are rarely cases of malicious corporate espionage. It's not usually a rogue spy stealing secrets.
What are they?
The vast majority fall under the miscellaneous errors pattern.
Well-meaning employees making mistakes.
Exactly. This is system administrators inadvertently exposing an AWS S3 bucket to the public internet, or developers hard-coding API keys into public GitHub repositories.
Right. The damage is still substantial, but the intent is benign negligence rather than sabotage. Okay. And when we look at the assets targeted in VIRUS, Servers dominate at 84%, which aligns perfectly with that massive spike in vulnerability exploitation we discussed earlier. They're hitting the web applications and databases directly.
Right, bypassing the endpoint.
Interestingly, though, persons remain the target in 23% of incidents, which indicates that while social engineering has taken a backseat to CVE exploitation, human manipulation still remains a critical supplementary vector.
It definitely does. But the intersection of those assets and actors leads us to, honestly, the most economically fascinating aspect of the report, the system intrusion pattern.
The bizarre economics of the dark web.
Exactly. This pattern is primarily driven by ransomware, which accounts for 60% of breaches within this category. However, the operational pipeline of a ransomware deployment has fundamentally fractured into specialized disciplines.
What do you mean by fractured?
Well, the syndicates executing the encryption payloads, the ones demanding the ransom, they are rarely the same entities writing the initial exploits or breaking into the network.
Really? So who is breaking in?
The ecosystem relies almost entirely on initial access brokers, or IABs. These are basically the specialized wholesale distributors of the dark web.
Ah, IABs. Okay, so how does that pipeline work?
The IAB executes the automated scanning, exploits the edge device vulnerability, establishes persistence, maps the internal subnets, and then they just auction off that verified access to the highest bidding ransomware as a service affiliate.
So they do all the hard work of kicking the door down and then just sell the open door.
Exactly. And the DBIR track the commodity pricing of this access. The economic realities are just jarring.
This is the stat from the beginning of the deep dive.
Yes, if an IAB compromises a standard unprivileged user account within a corporate environment, that access sells for a median price of just $700.
$700.
And if they compromise an administrative account, meaning root access, domain admin privileges, the median price is only $1,300.
See, that pricing model defies logic at first glance. $1,300 to bypass a Fortune 500 company's multi-million-dollar security stack? I mean, it is incredibly cheap to buy the keys to a kingdom.
It is, but applying basic supply and demand economics explains the depression in price. The market is completely saturated with supply.
Because of all those unpatched vulnerabilities.
Exactly. The combination of 184 million unpatched vulnerabilities paired with the relentless operational tempo of InfoStealer malware, things like Redline and Raccoon that are just dumping terabytes of session cookies and credentials daily, it means IABs are dealing in massive volume.
Ah, so it's fundamentally a buyer's market for network access.
Completely.
Okay, so once that access is purchased, how are they moving around? Because the telemetry regarding how attackers navigate the internal environment reveals a pretty distinct evolution in tradecraft too, right?
Yeah, big time. Historically, endpoint detection and response tools, EDRs, were tuned to hunt for specific anomalous binaries. Tools like Cobalt Strike.
Right, which is a legitimate penetration testing framework that got heavily co-opted by threat actors.
Exactly. But Cobalt Strike became incredibly noisy. Defenders learned to detect it. If a modern SOC sees a Cobalt Strike beacon initiating a connection, the containment protocols trigger instantly.
So the attackers pivot to what we call living off the land techniques.
Right. They discard the bespoke, compiled malware entirely, and just utilize the exact same administrative tools your IT department uses.
Hiding in plain sight.
The DBIR documents a massive surge in the weaponization of remote monitoring and management platforms. So tools like AnyDesk, TeamViewer, or legitimate corporate VPN clients.
And the evasion technique here is brilliant in its simplicity, honestly, because if an attacker purchases valid VPN credentials from an IAB and then authenticates from a residential proxy IP to bypass geographic restrictions, and then uses a native Windows management tool to establish an RDP session to a domain controller, standard signature-based antivirus registers 0 anomalies.
0. Because it simply looks like a remote systems administrator executing standard maintenance.
Right, so defenders are forced to pivot from analyzing file hashes to analyzing behavioral telemetry. Looking for parent-child process execution anomalies or impossible travel scenarios and identity logs.
It makes defense exponentially harder. And this evolution in evasion tactics extends heavily into their social engineering campaigns as well.
Right, you mentioned humans are still targeted 23% of the time.
Yeah, and the DBIR outlines this surging tactic known as click fix.
Click fix, what is that?
Attackers inject malicious JavaScript into compromised but legitimate websites. When a user navigates to the page, they are presented with a highly realistic, localized capi-chiche prompt. Prove you are human.
We see those 10 times a day.
Exactly. The psychology behind ClickFix weaponizes user fatigue. We are so conditioned to accept security friction.
We just click the buttons to get to the article.
Right. So when the prompt instructs the user to, say, press a specific key combination to verify they are human, they're actually executing a PowerShell command that bypasses the browser's sandbox and pulls down a remote access Trojan directly to the endpoint.
Oh, wow. So the human being is tricked into manually executing the bypass. They do the hacking for the attacker.
Yes. And furthermore, they are pushing these deception campaigns into out-of-band communication channels, too. The report highlights the proliferation of vishing, voice phishing, enabled by mobile malware variants like Fake Call.
Fake call on Android, right?
Yeah, so Fake Call abuses the accessibility services that are natively built into the Android operating system.
How does it work?
Well, when a targeted user attempts to initiate a phone call to their legitimate financial institution's published support number, the malware actually intercepts the dialing intent.
Wait, it intercepts the outgoing call?
Yes, it drops the outbound connection and seamlessly overlays a fake calling screen while routing the audio to a threat actor's VoIP server.
So the user dials the correct number on the back of their credit card.
But they are connected directly to the syndicate.
That is insane. It's an intersection of technical device compromise and human manipulation that completely bypasses all network-level monitoring.
Because the network never even sees it.
Right. So examining these macro trends, the vulnerability scanning, the third-party supply chain architecture, the living off the land binaries, it requires context, and the DBIR excels at segmenting this telemetry by industry, because it proves that threat actor behavior morphs based on the specific leverage available within a sector.
Absolutely. The attack surface invariably dictates the methodology.
Which is another critical reason why security leaders utilize www.cisomarketplace.com. Finding tailored vendor solutions designed for the specific regulatory and architectural constraints of your vertical is mandatory. A generic, one-size-fits-all perimeter defense is a totally depreciated strategy.
Yeah, you have to know your industry's specific threat profile.
Right. So let's analyze some industry snapshots. Let's start with the educational services sector. The threat profile here is heavily skewed.
Extremely skewed. In education, the primary vector is remarkably concentrated. 71% of all successful attacks originate through web applications.
71%. That's massive. And to understand why, we really have to look at the architectural reality of higher education. You are dealing with highly decentralized environments.
Super messy networks.
Oh, yeah. Universities maintain massive, sprawling infrastructures. They have student portals, legacy grading systems, alumni donation platforms, and just vast databases of personally identifiable information, PII.
And all of this is internet-facing.
Exactly. Often stitched together with complex middleware and accessed by tens of thousands of transient users, students with wildly varying security hygiene.
And the DBIR provides a really clinical postmortem of the ClaroP ransomware gang's campaign in late 2025, which perfectly illustrates this vulnerability.
The Oracle e-business suite attack.
Yes, ClaroP targeted a zero-day vulnerability within Oracle's e-business suite EBS. Now, because EBS is an integrated suite of applications managing everything from supply chain to human resources, it relies on these really complex routing architectures. Right. The attackers identified an unauthenticated route within a specific module. It was similar to historical flaws in the web application's desktop integrator that basically allowed for arbitrary file upload.
And because this was a 0-day, no patches existed.
None. So Colsp didn't need to phish a university administrator. They simply scripted an automated payload delivery targeting the exposed EBS endpoints.
And because of the homogeneous nature of higher education infrastructure, where hundreds of institutions rely on the exact same Oracle deployments, that single vulnerability allowed Colsp to systematically compromise over 100 educational organizations in a matter of days.
Just dominoes falling.
Yeah.
It demonstrates how a single structural flaw in a widely adopted web application creates a cascading systemic failure across an entire vertical.
Okay, so that's education. Shifting to manufacturing, the leverage model flips entirely. We move from the extraction of PII to the disruption of physical kinetic processes.
Right, factories stopping.
The DBIR shows that ransomware accounts for a massive 61% of all breaches in the manufacturing sector.
Because extortion relies on operational pressure. In a manufacturing environment, the cost of downtime is calculated in millions of dollars per hour.
It's immediate pain.
Exactly. And the convergence of information technology networks, IT and operational technology, OT, like the SCADA systems and programmable logic controllers driving the assembly line's feed, has created a hyper-vulnerable attack surface.
Because historically, we relied on the Purdue model of segmentation, right? Which separated corporate IT from the factory floor OT.
Right, the air gap.
But that has severely degraded due to the business demand for real-time analytics and remote maintenance. Executives want to see factory metrics on their iPads.
And that breaks the air gap. The report details the ransomware attack on Asahi Group Holdings in Japan as a prime example.
What happened there?
The threat actors breached the corporate IT network, but because of improper segmentation, the encryption payload propagated directly into the OT environment.
Oh, no.
The attack forced a total physical shutdown of their domestic manufacturing facilities. The robotics, the logistics routing, the shipping, manifest everything ground to a complete halt.
But the extortion isn't limited to just holding the physical processes hostage, right?
Yeah.
Because the DBIR mentions internal data is involved in 80% of manufacturing breaches.
Right. So in 80% of those breaches, data is exfiltrated prior to the encryption event. Threat actors recognize the immense value of intellectual property in this sector.
So they're stealing the IP before they lock the doors.
Yes, they systematically locate the file shares containing proprietary CAD blueprints, chemical formulas, confidential production forecasts. They exfiltrate the data, and then they deploy the ransomware. It is the double extortion model optimized for maximum leverage.
That is brutal. Okay, moving to public administration, so federal agencies, municipalities, local government. The DBIR reveals a really fascinating bifurcation in threat actor motivation here.
It does, because historically, public administration was viewed primarily through the lens of cyber espionage, spies hacking governments.
Right. But the data confirms that financially motivated criminal syndicates are actually responsible for 69% of breaches in this sector.
Yeah, municipalities, particularly local governments, they operate with really constrained IT budgets and extensive legacy infrastructure.
So they are highly susceptible, high-leverage targets for ransomware deployments.
Exactly. Nevertheless, state-affiliated actors engaging in advanced, persistent espionage still represent a massive 35% of breaches in this sector.
Which is a significantly higher concentration than in any private industry.
Oh, absolutely. The DBIR references the breach of the U.S. Treasury by Silk Typhoon, which is a sophisticated Chinese-aligned nexus.
And the Silk Typhoon intrusion is highly instructive because it highlights that intersection of state-sponsored tradecraft and third-party risk we talked about earlier.
Right, they didn't go through the front door.
No. The threat actors did not assault the Treasury's hardened external gateways. Instead, they compromised a vulnerability in a third-party, cloud-based support appliance that was widely used across federal agencies.
So by establishing persistence on an edge device that the security teams inherently trusted, they bypassed deep packet inspection entirely and maintained covert access for months.
But the public administration sector also suffers acutely from internal architectural failures, specifically a pattern the DBIR classifies as misdelivery.
Ah, yes, misdelivery. Because government entities process a staggering volume of highly sensitive citizen data and classified correspondence, the statistical probability of human error is just magnified.
Right, it's a numbers game.
Yeah.
So misdelivery encompasses, the HR director who accidentally attaches an unencrypted spreadsheet of employee social security numbers to a mass internal email.
Or the caseworker who just selects the wrong John Smith from the Outlook autocomplete cache.
Exactly. And without data loss prevention tools actively inspecting outbound traffic for regulated data patterns, these miscellaneous errors result in massive self-inflicted data disclosures.
The enemy is us.
Truly. Finally, let's analyze the retail sector. The DBIR defines a specific operational lifecycle for retail that they term the unholy trio.
The unholy trio: vulnerability exploitation, stolen credentials, and ransomware.
Right, because the architecture of retail requires massive internet-facing e-commerce platforms connected directly to internal customer databases containing immense volumes of payment card industry data and PII.
And the life cycle of this unholy trio typically operates in a very specific sequence. The attackers exploit a vulnerability, say a flaw in a Magento e-commerce plugin, or an unpatched load balancer to gain their initial foothold.
Okay, step one.
Once inside, step two. They use living off the land techniques to scrape memory for valid administrator credentials.
Step three.
They use those stolen credentials to traverse the network, locate the customer databases, and exfiltrate the data. And only then do they execute the ransomware payload to cover their tracks and initiate the extortion cycle.
The breach of the retailer hot topic, which exposed 57 million customer records, is like a textbook execution of this methodology.
It really is, and the volume of data extracted in these retail breaches is precisely what fuels the initial access broker markets we discussed earlier.
Right, the cycle continues.
Because the credentials stolen from a retail database today become the initial access vector for a manufacturing breach tomorrow. The ecosystem is entirely cyclical.
Okay, so the ultimate purpose of analyzing the cyclical ecosystem is application. Because telemetry without a localized operational framework is just, academic trivia.
Right. How do we actually use
How
this?
do we apply this? And I want to address the small and medium-sized business demographic, the SMBs, directly here, because there is a pervasive, highly dangerous cognitive bias in the SMB market.
The "we're too small to care" bias.
Yes, the operators of mid-market logistics firms, regional healthcare clinics, or boutique legal practices, they consistently assume their lack of brand recognition provides a layer of security. They think, I'm too small to be a target. They assume the sophisticated threat actors are exclusively targeting the Fortune 500.
And the DBIR dataset violently disproves that hypothesis. When segmenting the 31,000 incidents by organization size, and they define SMBs as having fewer than 1,000 employees, the statistical distribution of breach patterns mirrors the large enterprise dataset almost identically.
Almost identically, system intrusion remains their number one threat. Vulnerability exploitation remains the primary ingress vector.
Because the automation mechanics, the scanning scripts, they don't care. An agentic AI or a mass scanning Python script does not evaluate the market capitalization or brand prestige of an IP address.
It doesn't check your LinkedIn follower count.
Right. It iterates through the IPv4 space, parses the banner grab, identifies an unpatched Fortinet firewall or a vulnerable Microsoft Exchange server, and executes the exploit payload. It is entirely indiscriminate.
If your systems are externally exposed and vulnerable, you will be compromised. Security through obscurity was a flawed concept 20 years ago, but against automated AI botnets, it is literal algorithmic suicide.
Strong words, but accurate. Transforming this massive statistical dataset into actionable intelligence, though, it requires a disciplined methodology. And Appendix C of the report, authored by cyber risk quantification expert Tony Martin-Vague, provides the necessary framework.
And what's his core advice?
He emphatically argues that the DBIR must be utilized as an actuarial baseline, not a localized predictive model.
Right. It's like a weather report telling you it's raining in your city, but you still have to look at your own house to see if your roof is leaking.
That's exactly it. The DBIR represents a macro distribution of historical outcomes across the global landscape. It tells you what attack vectors are succeeding systemically. It does not calculate the specific mathematical probability of your specific network being breached next Tuesday.
So how do you use it?
You integrate the DBIR's macro baseline with your internal microtelemetry. You utilize Bayesian updating to adjust your risk models. So if the DBIR indicates that 71% of attacks in the education sector target web applications, you establish that as your prior probability.
Starting line.
Yes. Then you ingest your internal data. What does your last penetration test reveal? What is your current mean time to remediate critical CVEs? What percentage of your external endpoints lack MFA?
So if your internal telemetry reveals a robust zero-trust architecture, rigorous API gateway enforcement, and aggressive patch management, you update your localized risk probability downward from the DBIR baseline.
Exactly. Conversely, if your telemetry reveals severe technical debt and unmonitored legacy systems, your localized risk is exponentially higher than the industry average.
And generating that precise internal telemetry is no longer just a best practice. It is rapidly becoming a strict regulatory mandate. The DBIR references the shifting compliance landscape, specifically highlighting Australia's Cybersecurity Act of 2024.
Which is a huge legislative shift.
It is. Under their new 72-hour mandatory ransomware reporting regime, any entity exceeding a specific revenue threshold that executes a ransomware payment is legally compelled to report the incident, the threat actor details, and the technical indicators of compromise to the government within 72 hours.
Wow. So the era of quiet capitulation is over.
Yeah, where organizations quietly paid the extortion fee and swept the incident under the rug to avoid reputational damage. That's ending. Governments recognize that they cannot combat a systemic global threat without comprehensive visibility into the mechanics of the attacks. They are legislating telemetry collection, basically forcing organizations to build the internal monitoring capabilities necessary to comply.
So, synthesizing the immense volume of data within the 2026 DBIR requires us to really focus on the fundamental shifts in the architecture of cyber risk.
Let's summarize the key takeaways. The primary takeaway is the definitive flip in initial access vectors. Vulnerability exploitation has decisively overtaken credential
Right,
abuse.
patch your windows.
The window between vulnerability disclosure and automated mass exploitation is shrinking rapidly. Security programs must transition from reactive, compliance-driven patching cycles to proactive, threat intelligence-driven remediation. You simply cannot leave 184 million instances exposed on day 28 and expect your perimeter to hold.
Secondly, the perimeter itself is an obsolete concept. 48% of breaches involve a third-party vector. You must apply stringent, cryptographically verifiable controls to your supply chain
Require MFA, monitor API connections.
and utilize platforms that provide continuous visibility into your vendor's security posture.
Third, AI is actively compressing the kill chain. It is lowering the technical barrier to entry for criminal syndicates and automating the reconnaissance phase, creating severe resource exhaustion for defending SOCs.
Yet, despite all these advancements in threat actor capabilities, the DBIR's core philosophy of cyber stoicism still holds true.
Stick to the fundamentals.
Exactly. The execution methods evolve, but the fundamental defensive principles, comprehensive asset inventory, strict access control, rapid vulnerability mitigation, and robust network segmentation remain the only mathematically viable defense.
We want to extend a final thanks to our sponsors, www.cisomarketplace.com and www.breach.company, for enabling this deep dive into the underlying mechanics of the 2026 DBIR. I strongly encourage security practitioners to utilize the full report as the actuarial baseline for their upcoming risk quantification models.
It's mandatory reading.
It really is. But to close out our analysis, I want to pivot from the historical data to the immediate horizon. Based on the trajectories we've mapped today, what is the most concerning extrapolation you see forming over the next 12 to 18 months?
Honestly, the convergence of the economic data and the automation capabilities points toward a very specific, chilling operational evolution.
Okay, what is it?
Well, we established that AI models are currently hyper-accelerating the reconnaissance and exploitation phases, and we know state-sponsored entities are developing dedicated agentic AI architectures. And crucially, we established that initial access brokers are currently selling fully validated administrative control of corporate networks on the dark web for roughly $1,300.
Right, so the friction lies entirely in the manual transaction and the human deployment of the payload.
Exactly the point. The logical next iteration of this ecosystem is total end-to-end automation.
Wait, total automation?
We are rapidly approaching the moment where autonomous agentic AI platforms will independently scrape the dark web marketplaces. They will utilize cryptocurrency to automatically purchase valid administrative credentials from IABs.
Oh my gosh.
They will ingest those credentials, map the targeted internal network, disable the EDR telemetry, and execute a highly tailored polymorphic ransomware campaign. And then it will initiate the extortion negotiations with the victim organization, entirely devoid of human intervention at any stage of the kill chain.
Without a human ever touching a keyboard.
The infrastructure exists today. It is merely a matter of integration. If the economic incentives remain this high, the question is no longer how human threat actors are getting in, but how long until human operators are entirely obsolete in the execution of cyber warfare. Who is really in control of the threat landscape tomorrow?
Wow, we are transitioning from defending against organized syndicates to defending against automated economic algorithms executing hostile takeovers. The complexity of the diagnostic landscape has permanently altered. That is a lot to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the DBIR. Apply the telemetry, verify your perimeters, and we will see you on the next deep dive.